as Paxton said, my name is Josh Shanko. I serve as the Executive Director for Texas DECA, going on my 5th year now. Prior to that, I was a marketing instructor at Frisco Wakeland High School. And before that, I was a student of DECA. And so I've been involved since I was 14 years old in some capacity. And for the last 3.5 years now, I've served on the Competitive Events Task Force for National DECA's high school programs. And so I want to introduce or go through kind of a deeper dive into two of the main functions of our competitive events structure, and that is the exam blueprint, as well as the role play, the parts of the role play, and try to present them in ways that you can share that with your students to hopefully they understand the different parts and what they need to be studying and preparing for competition. So I think I have the opportunity to share my screen here. Okay. So everybody able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So this is again in two parts. It's the DECA exam and the okay. Not sure what's happening there. So it's the DECA exam, the blueprint for understanding. That's the first part that I want to go through. And so the blueprint is basically designed for the 7 different exams that we have, but we're really going to dive into the difference between the business administration core and the 4 cluster exams. And so each exam is specific to certain events. And so you'll see that within each exam, there's a number of different events that coordinate that. So the business admin core, that's only for those first year students, the principals events. We have the BMA exam for business law and team, as well as human resources. Entrepreneurship is just for the individual and the team. Finance, we do see we've got 3 role play events here, as well as financial consulting, which is a prepared event, but that one does have the exam. Over on the hospitality exam, we have 5 role play events, as well as that professional selling for hospitality and tourism. But we've got the 2 team events and 3 individual series. And then for marketing, you see a large number of events here, as well as the professional selling and the integrated marketing campaign, which is a written event component that has the test as well. And then this weird little event that we don't know really how to describe or how it fits in, but personal financial literacy, it has its own exam. So we're going to kind of look at what makes up each exam and how they and how we are coming up with those test questions. And so the basics of that is each exam is 100 questions. And that's going to be at the district or regional, state, association level, and then at ICDC. All of our exams are multiple choice. True, false, and combination items are generally not used. If you look at the last 8 years of exams, I don't think you'll find one true, false answer choice or question choice there. They're all A through D, A, B, C, D question options. The blueprints are provided. They're broken down by instructional area. We'll cover that in a second. One important thing about the testing is that it's fully objective, and so it is completely up to the student. I know sometimes whenever kids are competing, they'll get to a role play and say, "Oh, I really didn't know much about that," and so it's hard for them to really feel passionate about that because it may be something that's just out of their wheelhouse. Whereas the test is something that they can 100% prepare for. They know relatively what's going to be on it, and their success is going to be up to the efforts that they put in prior to it. And team events, the one thing is that the test score is averaged. So for those team decision-making events, it's averaged for the 2 individuals. And then for an integrated marketing campaign event where it's a team of 1 to 3, it is averaged based off of the number of students that compete. And so if you have a team of 3, but maybe 1 no-shows the day of competition, that 3rd person's score is dropped, and then the other 2 people, those 2 students' scores, are averaged out to be calculated. The exam blueprint is probably the biggest thing for advisors and for students to understand when it comes to the testing structure. And so the exam blueprint is broken down based off of the instructional area that that is covered within each exam. And so you can find that exam blueprint on the DECA Inc. competitive events page. And so they have just restructured it. If you haven't been to the competitive events page of the website in the last probably 2 weeks or so, do go in and check it out, because they've adjusted it. For instance, now you don't have to scroll all the way down to find those competitive events. They've condensed that to make it a little bit easier and more user-friendly. But in that middle blue section there, you'll see a resources tab, and the last one there is the exam blueprint. If you click on that exam blueprint, then you'll find a PDF version similar to this, and it's going to cover all of the exams. You'll see the color coding is going to be consistent, and we go from there. So the exam blueprint is basically made up of the different performance indicators and where those instructional areas are coming from. So within that, there's the two important terms, the instructional area and the performance indicator. The instructional area is that broad area of content, whereas the performance indicator is the very specific piece of information that they're expected to address. So whenever we're talking on the blueprint, it's going to be the instructional area. Whenever they're studying the performance indicator list, it's going to be that specific piece of knowledge. So let's look to see what those look like, okay? For the principals events, we've got these 12 core instructional areas. So these 12 core instructional areas are also going to be on all 4 of the cluster exams. So the BMA, finance, hospitality and tourism, and the marketing cluster exams. All right, so these 12 are very important for the majority of the student exams. In addition to those BMA cluster or those BA clusters, instructional areas, each of those 4 clusters has additional instructional areas based off of the career cluster that they're looking at. So you'll see that that marketing instructional area has not only those 12 core, but additional 7 instructional areas to prepare for, 4 for the BMA, 4 for the finance, and then 8 or 7 for the hospitality and tourism. So all of those are different categories, those general areas of content knowledge that the students need to prepare for. The entrepreneurship one, that was introduced a couple years ago. And what's different about that is that it pulls from 3 of the clusters as well as the business admin core. So students for that exam, I would really stress to maybe not put a first-year kid in there unless they've already had some entrepreneurship courses or they've had at least 1 or 2 courses in these other clusters, because the breadth of knowledge that they're going to be expected to draw from is vast. Because not only do they need to have the full business admin core, but they need to have knowledge of those other 3 clusters too. The personal financial literacy, I say it's weird, it doesn't have the business admin core on it. It has only these 6, which is from the Jumpstart standards. And so you will be able to find these Jumpstart standards on the performance indicator or on the competitive events page under the performance indicator packet for this event. But it's just a little bit weird. So the math on here is going to be different whenever we're really looking at that blueprint. The performance indicator lists are broken down by cluster, and you'll see them here. And so when we're looking at that, it's also broken down into tiers. And so there's tiers 1 through 4. However, DECA only uses tiers 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 is the business admin core. You'll notice that it's the same 12 instructional areas that are part of that principals grouping. So those 12 instructional areas for the exam are across all of them. And then you'll get into the specific cluster, and then you get into the pathway. Now there's these 4 levels of specialization, and then there's the 6 curriculum planning levels. And each of them plays a little bit different, okay? So similar to the last pyramid here, We've got tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. We have tier 1, 2, and 3 as well. You'll see that tier 1 is across all event categories, but tier 2 for principals, there is no tier 2. They don't need to worry about the tier 2 performance indicators. So that packet of 50, 60 pages of performance indicators, they can stop at tier 1. Team decision-making events need to go on to tier 2 for the exam and the case study. And then those individual series events, they will have, they will see some of those performance indicators in the role play only. Those tier 3 performance indicators will not come into play on the exam. And the reason is because we use that cluster exam for those team decision-making and integrated marketing and selling events. So tier 1, those 12 basic areas of knowledge, that business administration core, will be on the exam and role play for all types of competitive events that have the exam. They'll be on the exam for team decision making, professional selling, IMC, and then individual series. But they will not appear on the exam for any event. The performance indicator list, like I said, it's broken down in 3. So tier 1 is the business admin core, tier 2 is the cluster, tier 3 is the pathway. At the start of every performance indicator list and packet that's on the DECA Competitive Events website, the first page of content is broken down just like this. It's got the table of contents for you, and then it has this specific pathway. Okay, down below this pathway will list out which events coordinate with that pathway. So if you have a student competing in marketing communication series events, they need to be preparing for tier 1 and tier 2, but only the specific pathway that aligns with their competitive event. So really they stop at page 39. They don't need to go on to page 40 to 57. Okay, so tiers 1 and 2 will be for those, but for those individual series, it's specific to whichever pathway is for their event. And again, that's going to be listed on this page of the table of contents for them. Here are the different parts of that performance indicator packet. At the top, you'll see the tier and the core or the cluster that it's associated with. And then you'll see this instructional area. Every instructional area also has a 2-digit or a 2-letter code. And so for this one, emotional intelligence, that 2-letter code is EI. And then below that are the performance indicators. And then that's going to be a very specific thing. So again, the instructional area is going to be this broad base of information. The performance indicator is a very specific piece that they are looking to complete or demonstrate. Something to consider, and whenever you're working with your students, is that the first word should drive the direction of their performance indicator. So for instance, this first word for describe the nature of emotional intelligence, they need to key on describe, define it. What is that? Assess personal strengths. One thing that really helps the judge to comprehend too is for them to repeat basically verbatim that performance indicator. Hey, when I was assessing the personal strengths and weaknesses, I broke it down, and so some of the strengths were this and some of the weaknesses were this, because these performance indicators are also what's going to be tied to the evaluation rubric, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit too. But then you'll also see off to the right another 2-digit code, and that's right here, and that's going to be the curriculum planning level. And then this last code here, and this is something that if you guys use MBA research a lot, you're probably familiar with this, but this is going to be the specific performance indicator. So EI at the top of here is going to be the instructional area, emotional intelligence, and 001 is that specific performance indicator. So whenever we get to exams, this is going to play a big part. So those curriculum planning levels, this last one here said PQ, that's for prerequisite. That's the basis, that's the basic knowledge and information that they need to have. Career sustaining is a piece of content or knowledge that they need to have to continue on in that field. And then specialist is designed for that level of information needed to advance, needed to become a strong source of content information. And so PQ is the most generic, and then it gets up as we go further down this list. Most of our competitive events stop at the specialist level. However, with the entrepreneurship exam, we are starting to see more of the bottom three there, which are supervisor, manager, and owner. And so just as we got more difficult from prerequisite through career sustaining through specialist, it gets the level of content knowledge needed for each of them becomes a little bit more difficult as you move on to supervisor, manager, and owner. I will say that there is no set combination of prereq for district levels, career sustaining for state. That's not the makeup of it. They're going to be pretty well spread out, except for the those principles of business administration events. All of those will be that PQ level, or that tier 1 level. That's going to be kind of that starting point there. As you get into tier 2, you'll see that change here to the cluster. And so this will let you know that you're in the right cluster. It'll have, again, the two-letter code for the instructional area. You'll start to see more SPs, more CSs, things like that. Again, the performance indicators, that's specific, and then we've got the broad range there. The percentages, this is the makeup of the blueprint. So the business administration core, those first 12 key instructional areas, that's going to be make up 60% of the district or regional level exam. The remaining, so for marketing, those other seven instructional areas will make up 40%. At the state level or association level, it's going to switch to a 50-50 blend. Then for ICDC, it switches to 40% content and 60% cluster. I know when I was teaching, my kids would always come up to me and say that the state test was easier than the district test. And that's because they'd spent more time preparing for the cluster material, because that's what we were going over in class, than that business admin core material. And that's because they're now seeing more of it as you move on into the different levels of competition. So it's very important to get them started off on those 12 business admin core questions or instructional areas at the start of the competitive events. And so then at ICDC, it is going to 40 and 60. So it's much heavier on this. I do know that there was some discussion to have these numbers shift a little bit to where they become even more cluster focused as we move on throughout the competitive event structure. And so that nothing's been published by DECA yet, but I do know that that's something that they're looking at to put more of an emphasis on the cluster portion for these 4 exams. So when we look at a question, so this is a typical question that we would find. Again, it's going to be all multiple choice, A through D. So written event or written communication is not effective when readers must, and then we see the 4 options there. We're all going to smile and nod our heads and say that the answer is going to be C, correct, hopefully. So C, boom. So whenever we have a key, and we use those practice testing, whether it's the ones that are available on DECA.org, if you've purchased some from Shop DECA, the answer key is going to have this following information. And so it's going to have the correct answer. It's going to have, or the correct answer choice is going to have the correct answer, which is work to understand what the communication means. Then it's going to have the rationale, and it's going to have the rationale why it's correct and why other options that may be close are incorrect. And then you'll see 2 sources here. The important thing for the source is that this tells you exactly where that instructional area is. So CO is the instructional code for communications. 016 tells you the specific or performance indicator that's listed in that packet. So if you went back to the packet, or if the kids start to go back to the packet to see why they missed it, then they'll find the instructional area of communications and the performance indicator, which is explain the nature of effective written communications. And then you'll see that curriculum planning level of CS as well. The second source is going to be where MBA Research, who creates the DECA exams, identified this content to create the question. And so that's the full source if you or the students wanted to dig even further into the rationale for it. So the exam question, again, is going to have the selection, the term, rationale, why it's correct, and if it's close, specifically if it's close, why other choices are incorrect. And then it's going to have the two sources, the instructional area and the performance indicator, and the documented source where the content answer came from. One thing to do as well is as students are going through practice exams, have them write this down, because you're going to start to see some trends of instructional areas that they consistently miss. And so, you know, if you give them the key to go and grade themselves, or if you're using online practice exams, have them keep track of those instructional areas, because what you'll see is that the exam is pretty well patterned. For instance, you know, if there's 8 communications questions, those 8 questions will be all pretty well in a row on most of the DECA exams. And so if a kid gets to a really rough patch, a really difficult part of a test, don't have them just skip to the next question. Have them skip down 10 questions to where they get completely out of that instructional area, and let them get back on focus in that next area to start getting into that flow of the exam again. And I think that that's really seemed to help students move forward. Some general test taking, you guys know this, but it's, you know, some things to familiarize your students with. The number one thing that I would say is familiarize yourself with the format. In Texas, we do all of our district and state level testing online, and so we provide practice testing online too, so that the students are practicing in the method in which they're going to compete. So if you're doing, you know, preparing for districts and it's going to be a paper exam, have them practice on a paper exam. You know, and then what we tell all of our kids, all of our teachers as we move to ICDC is it's going to be a paper test, so let's start practicing on paper, and that's when we will reshare some paper resources that they have available to them. And so that's probably the biggest thing that's been successful for students, is to make sure that they are familiarized with that. And that's whenever we went to the online testing format, we saw a lot of kids struggling with it because they've been so used to paper and pencil. Again, just some general test taking. You guys are pretty well aware of all of those. So I want to go back to the blueprint and kind of show you some things. And it's updated each year, and they just updated it, I think, last week, the blueprint for 2021. But what's important is this, and it's a long way to scroll back, so pardon my clicking here. I know it's difficult to see on your computer screen. I'll give Paxton the actual PDF document, and then she can forward that on to you guys too. And it's available, again, it's going to be available here on DECA's website. But it's broken down into each column. And so you'll see for district exactly how many questions are in each instructional area. And one thing that I love pointing out about this blueprint is that the reason it's so important to understand all of this is that if you think of a 100 question marketing exam, the fact that there's only, and again, I know we're difficult to see it, that number is a 1. There is 1 marketing instructional area question on the 100 question marketing cluster exam. But there are 11 emotional intelligence questions on that exam. So again, whenever students come back and say that the association level exam was easier than the district level exam, it's not, well, hopefully it's that they feel more prepared because they've spent an extra month or 2 preparing for that content, but it's also that the content that they're studying is more reflective of what's on the exam. So it's very important that they understand that makeup and that they understand the different parts of what makes that up. For instance, or especially the performance indicator and the instructional area. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to see if y'all have any questions about the exam before we get into the role play part. I know that was a lot, so if anybody has questions, I'd love to field some questions about the exam portion.
Hi, this is Jamie Wilson. I heard you when we went to Washington, D.C. For the power trip last year, and this was amazing, just trying to put all this together. I'm getting ready to start my 11th year. But I turned to all the things that you mentioned to us when we started studying and kind of changed the way kids were looking at the exams and how to study and how those exams relate directly with the role plays. But the problem that I found pretty quickly is this is a lot of paperwork and there's so many performance indicators. My kids got bored and I didn't know how to overcome that as a teacher, how to make it a little bit more exciting and interesting because there's just so much knowledge that we have to learn. How do you recommend that we make this a little bit more exciting to get into our kids' heads and get them to understand all this?
Absolutely. So it is a lot. You know, even if you're looking at an individual that's competing in the principals events, it's still a 25-page packet of those instructional areas. And I think, you know, what's been successful for some, you know, and I'm sure it's the same with Oklahoma, we have some programs that are just, they have high levels of success in those testing events. And so and talking to them, it's basically they go and they take a couple of practice exams just to kind of see where they're at. And then they find out what instructional areas they really struggle with. And so then they work on specifically those. And they'll kind of reflect and go through the entire packet throughout the year, but they really focus on the areas that they've struggled with. And that's why that's so important to identify early on. Another couple of things that you can do just in the classroom is take 4 or 5, you know, each class. I taught on a block schedule, so I saw them twice a week. So, you know, doing 5 twice a week wasn't difficult, but, you know, if you see them every day, maybe do 2 a day, and then you're covering 10 a week. You know, just different performance indicators as bell ringers. You can have them create Quizlets for the performance indicator. And then, so the question side would be the actual performance indicator. And then the back of it, or the answer side of the Quizlet, would be how they intend to answer that, or how, what kind of information they would need to answer that, especially those ones that are defined. The defining performance indicators are ones that, even if the student isn't comfortable with the performance indicator, they should be able to draw on that content knowledge and be able to score high marks on that portion of the rubric. So I would say to just try to break it down. Don't make them take it on all at once. You know, we have one program or one school that basically the kids aren't, they're kind of told not to go on DECA.org to find the competitive events. They're really geared just to go towards their school Canvas page. And that's because they've broken it down specific to that event in different parts. And so if they're doing, you know, apparel and accessories, you know, this checkpoint 1 has X number of performance indicators. And that's what they try to do it as, is really break it down into smaller digestible parts as much as possible. Is that a ton of work? Absolutely. Is it something that student officer teams can do? Absolutely. Is it something that you could get with 5 or 6 different schools in your area and say, hey, let's split this up? Absolutely. And so it's all about, you know, not trying to overwhelm the kid, but giving them information that is useful, showing them how it's useful, and breaking it down to where hopefully they stay engaged. And if you ask the kids that are succeeding, they're putting in the time throughout the year. So if they want to get up on that stage, they're going to put the time in.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Going through. Anybody else have questions about the exam blueprint? Okay. Going to get back in here. And get back into the parts of the role play. And so this is something that I actually do with my advisors at our annual advisor training, is this exact workshop, and I would give them a role play to work off of, because I think it's important for you guys to actually understand the timing of it and the stress of that 10 minutes. And so we're not going to do that now just because of time restraints, but it's definitely something that you can do with your officer team, is have them sit down and do a role play and then talk to them about some of these things as they're going through that prep time. And so let's look at what's in a role play. Give it a second. Of course, right as I do that, it catches up to it. All right, we'll just scroll through. Maybe. All right, it's acting up on me, so I'm going to, there we go. I'm going to be able to do it from here. We'll just do it from the PowerPoint, not try to put it in view if it keeps acting up on us. There we go. So what's in a role play? The first thing for them to understand is kind of what to expect. And so every role play that's going to be provided is going to have the same structure. It's going to have all of the same parts to it. And so with that, the first thing is at the top of every role play is going to be the cluster as well as the instructional area. So the cluster is going to be specific to your event. The instructional area is going to be the primary instructional area. And what's so important about the primary is that it is going to have multiple performance indicators from that one instructional area, but multiple instructional areas can be used for the same role play. Okay, so at the top is going to have the cluster and the primary instructional area. So you have the name of the event, then it's going to have the participant instructions. Now, these instructions are the same on every single role play. So if they've seen one practice role play, they don't need to waste 40 seconds and read this middle part because it's going to be the exact same every single time. It's going to have what their instructions are. So for individuals, it's 10 minutes for prep. The difference for team decision is that this says that they're going to have 30 minutes to review. Okay, and then they've got 10 minutes to present. For teams, they've got 15. One thing that's new for this year for team events is that it used to be 10 minutes plus 5 minutes for questions and answers. Now it's a combined full 15 minutes. So if the kids want to go up to 12 minutes in their presentation and leave the last 3 for questions, they can. They want to use the full 15 for their presentation, they can do that as well. Part of the reason for that change is that so many districts and state associations were already combining it that whenever they got to ICDC, it was kind of a culture shock whenever they would get cut off at 10. And so it is now a combined full 15-minute presentation for the team events. And then those 21st century skills will be detailed as well. Then the performance indicators. And so this is the most important part of page 1. These performance indicators are going to be specific to that case. They're also going to be indicated on the rubric itself. That's going to basically be where their score comes from. So for this is a principals event, so there are 4 performance indicators. We'll get into the rest of those in just a second. So that's page 1. Page 1 is the overview of the cluster, the primary instructional area, the participant instructions that they've seen multiple times, hopefully by this point, and then the most important part are the performance indicators. Page 2 is the case. And so there are several things to point out here that will make their time that much easier and more efficient, more efficiently used. And that is that in the first sentence of every role play will be their role, okay? On 98% of case studies, it's going to say you are to assume the role, or you are the role of whatever, okay? So for this person, it's a salesperson. In all caps will be the company name. Every time, the company name will be in all caps. It's important for the student to understand their role within the company as well as the judge's role within the company. You'll know that it's that because it will every time be in parentheses the word judge. So in the first paragraph, you're going to find out the student's role, the company that they're working with or for, and the judge's role, and that will allow them to set the stage. Anything that's not written on here, the student is allowed to add and to enhance their presentation. The next thing is that in either the second or the third paragraph, you're going to see this phrase. In this case, it's the third paragraph. You have been. You have been is going to be their task. So there here is to explain to the new salesperson how the sales team can communicate. That's the problem that they have to solve. Okay? And so those are going to be those 4 main parts, as their role, the company, the judge's role, and then what's the ask. Then they need to be flipping back here to identify what are those performance indicators that I need to answer, and how can I use the content that's here to solve this question or this ask. But every time you're going to find those 3 pieces of information, and then either in the second or the third paragraph like this, you will see you have been, or what is the task that they're looking to achieve. Okay, and so that's going to be, no matter what the content is, that will allow the students to become more familiar with the structure of the event. Now, the prep time is something that goes by really fast, whereas the presentation time is relatively the same. It is the same for the individuals. That part, the kids seem to fly through, right? So we always say like 10 minutes of preparation is like 4 minutes of presentation. And so it's really important that they go in ready to maximize their use of their prep time. So for principals and individual series, it is 10 minutes. For team decision making, it's 30 minutes, and then that 15-minute interview time. That's going to be consistent, or should be consistent for the district, association, and international levels. Some ways that they can break down that prep time, and this is super important, especially for students as they get going in competition, is how should they be managing their prep time? And so this is just a recommendation. This is not the end-all be-all way, but the first minute or so, they need to be reading and writing down the key information and performance indicators for that scenario. Then they need to move on to mapping out those ideas, rereading the scenario to make sure that their ideas align with the performance indicators, and then walk through the skeleton presentation. One important key that we've found successful in this last final walkthrough is for them to start to think of some questions that could be asked by the judge. And the reason for that is that part of the score is their ability to answer the judge's questions. And so if they're able to start to think about that, they'll be able to position their answer and be more prepared when that question comes. So this goes pretty quick, right? 4 minutes of mapping out your idea. You're going to spend some time reading it. You saw this case was, I think, only 4 paragraphs. This is probably a short scenario. We've seen some, especially those accounting ones, that take up almost the full page. Some of those accounting ones have a second page that's just the chart. So managing their time becomes really critical for the success of their presentation. For the team events, they've got a little bit more time to do that. And so definitely start with the same philosophy of reading the indicators in the scenario individually, breaking down the performance indicator list. Now, we have some people that will swear by the philosophy of, I'll take number 1, you take number 2, then and alternating. And while alternating is great for rhythm, alternating is not necessarily always great for the student's knowledge or the flow of the presentation. Just because those performance indicators are listed 1, 2, 3, 4, does not mean that they have to be answered and presented in that same order. So have them break it down based off of their content knowledge and their comfort level with it. Have them start to brainstorm and then map out the ideas, walk through it. You'll see this is a significantly longer portion, and that's because they've got 15 minutes to present. And then the last few minutes is have them ask each other a question. And that's been really successful. We've seen our team decision-making events find a ton of success in Orlando because we started to have them push this piece. And that's that they should be asking each other questions at the end to try to prepare their partner. The other thing that does is that makes sure that both partners have some sort of knowledge and information about what the other is saying. Whenever they spend time to walk through it, it happens all the time, right? If one of the competitors freezes, then the other student is there to kind of help pick them up, fill in any gaps that they may have lost, and potentially answer questions if the partner is unable to do so. So this is, again, just a recommendation for how those students can use this time. I mentioned that I do this as a kind of a workshop with teachers. You can do this with your students. And if you do it as an individual, kind of, talk through them. If you set them out in your class, hopefully we're able to set them out in our class this year, right? Start them at the time. And then at the 1 minute mark, say, okay, guys, y'all should be done reading. You should be writing down those key words. At the 2 minute mark, okay, have you started to map out your ideas? Kind of talk them through that 10-minute schedule. All right. And then once you get to that 6, 7 minute mark, say, okay, go back in, make sure that your performance indicators are getting met. Hey, you should be going through your walkthrough. Does that make sense? What's the right flow? Just talk them through that 10 minutes because I think that's going to help them pace themselves a little bit better. In competition, students are able to have their watch. They're not able to have their phone, or they should not have their phone out. And so the watch will give them an indicator depending upon the setting. So at our districts and state competition, our staff that's running the event does not go around giving them any warning besides a 2-minute warning. So it's going to be up to the kid to kind of keep track of their own time and pacing it at their own pace. And so that's going to be something that's going to be on them. But if they can start making those mental notes, it's going to be pretty effective. And again, that last part there is kind of be preparing themselves for the judges' questions. The materials that they're going to get, so they're going to get the plain paper. A few years ago, DECA got rid of the 2 sheets rule. Now it's basically they can have as much paper within reason that they want. Now, each district or the state can set different, parameters of you're going to get a maximum of 3 sheets of paper, whatever that ends up being. But talk about what they're going to get so that they really have an understanding of it. They should not be taking in, colored pencils, anything. They can take in their own pens if they want, but they should not be taking anything other than pencils or paper. But then they are able to really make the most out of that too. And so they would be able to, tear off a piece of paper and make a business card or fold it up into a pamphlet, whatever they wanted to do with that paper. The interview time, again, it's 10 and 15 minutes. So definitely start off based off of what your title is. And so that's why the role, understanding the role is so important. You know, that firm, hopefully we're having handshakes this year, fingers crossed, right? You know, but just kind of go through it. One thing that I think really helps them stand out is previous projects. Whenever I said that whatever is not written on the case, the kids have some opportunity to really adjust, and that lets them set their tone. If you're walking in to an interview and it's, you know, the judge's role is as the student's boss, and the kid says, "Hi, I'm Josh," well, you know, part of me says, well, duh, like, I'm your boss, you know. And so have them be aware of the situation and, introduce themselves as part of that situation. You know, they could say, as you know, I'm a salesperson here at the company name, blah, 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 but go through it. You know, try to see, you know, get some engagement levels, ask open-ended questions. If the kids only asked yes, no questions to the judge, then that's going to be wherever we get the judge just sat there and looked at me all day, right? Like, listening to 10 or 20 of these role plays gets boring, plain and simple, right? And in class, if you got the same kid covering this, you know, 20 kids covering the same topic, the 20th presentation is probably going to be pretty boring, I would assume. Have them try to bring some real world examples. I love buzzwords. You can have them, you know, whatever their industry is, have them create a list of 15 buzzwords and, you know, kind of charge them with using 2 or 3 in it. So like if you're doing a hospitality, you know, use the term plus plus, use the term BEO, use those buzzwords so that the judge, which is hopefully part of that industry, knows that you're more than just reading from that textbook answer. Okay. Tips, again, you know, making sure that those performance indicators line up. Definitely, as they're making their notes, have them write out which performance indicator is answered there, so then they see on their notes all of that. I always say that at the top of their notes, they should just go ahead and write out the performance indicators or the keywords, so that even if they space in their presentation, they've got those performance indicators written down that they can easily draw on and at least mention to get some of those points. Um, the performance indicators, there's 4 for principals, 5 for individual series, and 7 for teams. And they make up 70 to 72 points of the 100 question role play. So for team events, there's 10, there's 7, they're worth 10 points each. For principals, there's 4, they're worth 18 points each. That's 72 points. And then for the principal, or for the individual series, there's 5 and they're worth 14 points each for 70 points. The other 28 or 30 points, depending on the case, is those 21st century skills. So how they presented, how they were thinking critically, and the answers to the judge's questions. Resources, there's always some great resources available on Texas or on DECA.org. There's some great resources on TexasDECA.org too. DECA Direct has some great content, and then Shop DECA has some great content too. So I know we've got a few minutes left, bring it back here and see if y'all have questions about the role play portion. You know, this will be available. You can, if y'all have questions, you can reach out to me as well. But it's about finding the content that your students may struggle with and preparing them for that. And again, I think the biggest thing for role play is figuring out the best way to maximize that 10 minutes or 30 minutes of prep time, because that goes by very quickly. Okay.
Now's your chance to ask questions.
So, and I know we've had a few questions in the chat, and I'll just make sure everyone knows. I will make sure that this is posted and presentations are shared and all of that. I know we'll be putting them on CTU under the Oklahoma Summit tab, and then also on our Oklahoma DECA website. So don't worry, you're going to have access to all of this information.
Awesome.
So, and Josh, we do have a question from the chat. It says, do you recommend a certain platform to do a role play online? Flipgrid, Zoom?
So Flipgrid, I know that right now I think they've got 5 or 10-minute video limits, and so if that's something that you're looking to do, consider that. But Zoom, Microsoft Teams, it's really going to be whatever your school district allows. I know whenever we're discussing maybe doing a mock competition for role plays, the biggest issue is that each school district has their own restrictions on what platform. So use the one that's best for you. I think the online system is going to be different. I know that we're expecting, as association leaders, we're expecting to find out a lot more information next week from National DECA when we have our CAM conference. But it's really going to be whatever platform is most useful there. Flipgrid, what we've seen from that software is that you are able to post different questions at interval times. So just like the judges question there, but I think they're all going to be relatively the same or have the same outcome. It's just what's going to be allowed by your individual school district.
DECA has several different things that you can use to study. We have a lot of books that we've ordered from Shop DECA. I have a lot of older CDs that have the electronic versions of the tests, which are super nice to be able to go in because it gives you immediate right or wrong and all the information about why it's wrong, like you just went over. What does Texas use? I think I remember from the Power Trip you mentioning that you have online study tools that you have available to your schools in Texas. Is that true?
Correct. Yeah, and I can share that information with Jackie and Paxton too, but we do provide the last 8 years of district level exams provided on a web platform to where they are, just like you were saying, able to go in and take 20, 50, 100 question portions of the exam and find out instantaneous, what that result is. And we do include the rationale in our answers so that they can see that. We started that 3 years ago, and our test scores have gone up 7.3 points since inception. So
yeah, I can imagine. Paxton, is that something that we could
I
tap
already
into?
have. Yeah, I already have it on my list. When he mentioned that they did online practice tests, I already wrote down, ask Josh what he uses, how he does that. So I'll connect with him to make sure we're not violating DECA's rules, but that we're also providing you guys what you need to be successful. So yeah, I'm going to talk to him about that.
Because I know when they quit making the CDs and just went to the books only, man, it really slowed down our study sessions and the ability for kids to learn a little bit quicker. And that online stuff would be just amazing. That'd be really good.
Well, and they can do it from their cell phone, which they're on 20 hours a day anyways. So yeah, we can definitely share that content with you.
You know my kids. That's amazing.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, perfect. Well, if anyone else thinks of questions later on, if I can't answer them, then I can definitely forward them on to Josh. And if he's gracious enough to answer them, then that would be amazing. Josh, thank you so much for being here and talking to our Oklahoma advisors.
Definitely. All righty. Y'all have a good one. Go TCU.
Okay, Jackie, are you good? If not, I'm going to close this meeting out.
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jackie.